Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest really needs no introduction. In my opinion, he is the best champion for liberty in many, many decades. He is a true statesman for the United States, criticizing both political parties, trying to defend the Constitution when others in both political parties, the bureaucracy, trample on it. Dr. Ron Paul, thank you for joining me again.
Great to be with you.
Now, Dr. Paul, my listeners, I have them all over the United States and all over the world, but not all of them have lived in the D.C. metro area. So I want to get your insights because you were in Congress for a very long time and lived around here. How much influence does the Pentagon and the military, industrial, and information complex have over Congress, both political parties, whoever is U.S. president, and the bureaucracy here in the D.C. metro area?
Well, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, and there's a good reason for that. It's because they have the biggest budget for one individual group of people. So it is huge, and one thing for sure, and I make this point a lot, it's very bipartisan. It isn't like, because Democrats have a reputation of looking for a new war, a little less than Republicans. It has nothing to do with who supports the military-industrial complex. You take a guy like Bernie Sanders, if some weaponry is being built in Vermont, he was able to support this. So this is something that is very bipartisan. When they build big weapons like the F-35, they put parts of it in every state. So it's considered not very smart if something is done in your state or in particular your district to vote against it. So that's the way they do that. But they are very, very powerful. They're involved in elections and they're involved in lobbying efforts, and they usually get what they want, and that's one of the reasons why the military budget is so high. And I call it a military budget because they just had the National Defense Authorization Act, but it really doesn't have anything to do with defense. It has to do with just fighting wars. It's really a sad situation.
Yeah, you talked about the pork that's being spread around. That's a good strategy for them to buy off different congressmen and senators with votes. And then the Pentagon routinely fails internal audits, and you talked on the Ron Paul Liberty Report about how the Pentagon knew it was going to fail this massive audit, and they didn't seem to care.
No, and that brings up the subject of why don't they care? What if they had to collect money from the people from what they earn, to pay for the welfare warfare state, but they don't have to. It's designed so that spending doesn't really matter as long as you have a Federal Reserve System that will accommodate and monetize the debt. So right now, just look at what's going on. I mean, and Republicans are supposed to be more conservatives, and yet the spending and the deficits are just exploding. And I look at this by always reminding myself that spending is a tax in itself. They say, well, we'll borrow the money or we'll print the money, but we're not going to send out a bill to the American people to pay, higher income tax because they'd rebel, and which would be very good. And that's one of the reasons why the Fed is so dangerous. But what they do is they run up the debt, they issue bonds, and people buy them. It's amazing that they keep buying them. Right now, they don't even earn any interest and they still keep buying these bonds, but they don't have a lot of other choices. But it also shows that the whole system is very fragile, and you can't finance the welfare warfare state by endlessly printing money and creating credit, because eventually confidence will be lost. But right now, the confidence is still there with our system and with our dollar, because the other countries are actually managing their affairs worse than ours. So it'll be catastrophic when it occurs, when people finally give up in the trust of the money. But that day will come, and I think the markets are very rocky right now, and they're struggling to keep it going. The whole idea of keeping a market going is to prop up by printing more money, and they're doing this with negative interest rates. People just don't seem to care that much, but they will care a whole lot when it comes unraveled, and markets always correct themselves. The markets eventually are always more powerful than a government.
And another thing, Dr. Paul, that most people don't understand unless they live here in the D.C. metro area or they have family or friends who live here, is that so many jobs are connected one way or another to the military-industrial complex, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, or the information complex, so intelligence, information. Like we're the Ron Paul Institute conference, which is coming up in about a month from now. It's at the Dulles Airport Marriott. And right around there, Dr. Paul, there's the Reston Town Center and all this, and almost all the buildings there are all these military, industrial, and information complex companies with enormous buildings.
Yes, and lately they're not even shy in admitting what's going on. They always pretend it's, defending the country we're at war and that sort of thing, which we always are and shouldn't be spending that money. But the conservative and our president is leading the charge on this. He's not hiding from it because he said, well, we can't discipline or treat Saudi Arabia, in any other way other than friendly because they buy a lot of stuff from us and it's good for our jobs. So he's really up front. We can have an aggressive foreign policy against Iran, but not Saudi Arabia because they're spending their money, and the deal was we would provide weapons and defense for them as long as they take their oil money and spend it back in this country. So, but it's I call it military Keynesianism. So most conservative Republicans would never admit they're Keynesian in that they are that they spend money just to produce jobs, but they do it, they know it, but they won't admit it.
So I want to ask you about the likelihood of war in the near future with Iran and Venezuela. So the Vice President, Mike Pence, gave a keynote address or a speech, I think, at one of the military academies, basically telling the cadets who are graduating that the likelihood is they're going to be in a war in the near future. You talked about the economy, how it was going to get worse, how the dollar was going to be eventually devalued. Do you think then the most likely strategy is to start another war as a distraction?
Well, that seems to be what happens so often, and Trump is a mixed bag because I think some of his instincts, are good in that he would like to end some wars, but he doesn't want to end the spending. And I think when he backed off on bombing Iran just recently, I think that's part of his instincts, in spite of what Bolton and Pompeo what they were telling him to do. So I think there's a great danger. There could be a false flag. Maybe our government won't go out and deliberately start the war, but accidents can happen. There can be false flags, and there is a great danger of that happening. And I think that I don't think people really are other than people like Bolton, but Bolton's in a pretty important position. I mean, he's delighted when there was a little bit of conflict over there with the vessels going on. He thought this was just great, but and it does seem like if you put what you said in the context of the Depression, a lot of people think that we didn't get out of the Depression until we had World War II. World War II.
That's the common perception there, is that the Depression spending, the Keynesians like Paul Krugman and others claim that the spending from the military in World War II got us out of the Depression, but I've seen plenty of Austrian school economists at the Mises Institute basically call that a fallacy and disprove that. So I want to ask you now, I'm not sure if you're aware that this month is the 8-year anniversary of the one-time partial audit that you got on the Federal Reserve from the Government Accountability Office. So do you think the lawyers from the Federal Reserve would ever allow even a partial audit again?
Probably not. They're not going to want the truth to come out, and that's the reason they won't have the audit, just like they don't really audit the Pentagon spending either, and those are billions and billions of dollars. So no, that's not going to happen. I think we should keep arguing for it, because that shows you there's a special reason why they want to remain secret, and that, of course, is because they're up to no good. But no, I don't think that's going to come. We're going to keep working on it because it calls attention to it. Because before we started doing that, nobody even talked about the Federal Reserve. We got a partial audit, and when we have the votes, the American people are for, a little bit more openness with the Fed. but the people that are in the administrations and the leaders in the House and the Senate, they will not permit it to happen. So I wished I could say that. But in some ways it doesn't matter. I think the important thing is getting the attention, getting people to think about it, getting to them to understand monetary policy and why the system is so bad, because it's going to come unglued, and hopefully we can rebuild it without a central bank. I mean, that's what the founders wanted, and there's no reason why we can't argue the case again, but that's why individuals like you are out there talking about it all the time. We need a lot of people continuing to talk about it to get more people to understand exactly why we do want a change in our monetary system.
So the audit uncovered that European banks, European governments, European corporations, a lot of foreign governments, foreign corporations, foreign central banks were getting bailed out. Do you think that those backdoor bailouts, covert quantitative easing, are going to continue then?
Yeah, they're going to continue, and I'm sure they're continuing now. If they're a special group, they're going to get help. And I believe that there's a lot of coordination with foreign policy, too, because, funds can be transferred to certain governments and certain, when we're involved in CIA operations and regime changes, there's alternative ways of financing those systems. It doesn't all, matter of fact, only a small amount goes through the budgetary process. Just think of those trillions of dollars that you referred to. That had nothing to do with the Congress, and Congress really still spends. Look at what they're doing right now. I mean, the deficit's exploding, the spending is exploding, and then there's still trillions and trillions of other dollars that are being circulated, through the monetary system, and that's what happened, especially on the bailout. But I think it happens routinely in a smaller amounts, and it just gets absorbed. It's that we are still a very rich and very powerful country, and people are trusting the system because there's nothing else. But there's people shopping around. Some of the other countries are net purchasers of gold. When you look at what's happening, with Japan and China and Russia, they're buying because they think someday that the system will come apart. So I think that will happen. And I think the more the governments and the people own gold, the better. I'd like the people to own the gold, but it's better that these other countries have it to help the reform to occur. The perfect thing would be to have a maximum liberty and let the people just decide what they want to use for money. But, of course, that's not going to be allowed because the reason governments exist is to collect more money to subsidize their governments. And I think we're addicted to big government, and that makes a problem. But there is a limitation. There's going to be a limitation on the spending, the amount of inflation that they can have, and I think we're getting very close to that. And
to add to your point, sir, there's been a misinformation campaign, in my opinion, on the Federal Reserve audit you did. I hear from people every single day, at least a couple of people, claiming that the audit never happened. I even hear from financial professionals who look over news articles and stories and are supposed to know this stuff, and libertarians and Austrian school economists, and they're not aware that the audit even happened. It's almost as if that a lot of the articles are very tough to find and search. It's very difficult to try to convince them, even when I send them the articles, that you got the audit.
Well, they were, they permitted some of the audit, some of the audit, but it's in big terms, in large numbers, but it doesn't deal with individuals and what company benefited, what bank benefited, and so it was, and you described it correctly, it was a partial audit, it wasn't a complete audit, and it's the ongoing process that is necessary too, because they operate independently, and yet I thought it was very beneficial because it wasn't because I had a powerful position in Congress. I didn't. You really couldn't have any political clout, but as you recall, what we did was through the Congressional Office and Campaign for Liberty, we went to the people, and they are the ones who put pressure on their congressman to vote a certain way. So that should be encouraging that things can change, but it's more likely I was more interested in changing people's minds and ideas and what their understanding was than I was in trying to say, well, I'm going to be the chairman of the banking committee, and then I'm going to have a lot of power. Well, it wouldn't have happened anyway. The system wouldn't have permitted that. So to change people's minds is the most important thing, and that means if we have enough people understanding this, and there is a crisis, or when there is a crisis, then maybe we'll have have a more sensible monetary system.
You talked about the limits to government spending, to taxing, to currency debasement or monetary inflation, but I'm seeing a rise in popularity in socialism, a rise in popularity in MMT, modern monetary theory. Now, you studied financial history, Dr. Paul. Why are socialism and MMT becoming so popular right now?
Well, it's hard to say, for everybody that's doing this, because I think the numbers are small, but they're getting a lot of attention. I think one thing is that the people who operate our economy now have made themselves more vulnerable, because the contest right now, it seems they've couched it in terms of socialism versus capitalism. And the socialists want something fairer because things aren't right, and some people are poor, and some people don't have houses, and the people are living in the streets, too many wars. So they have arguments that would be the same as our arguments. But the problem is that the establishment, conservatives and Republicans, are saying, "Oh no, this you're misconstruing it," and I think that is what the problem is, because we're not. If we allow them to get away by calling what we have today as capitalism and free markets, I don't like it either. I don't like the Fed. I don't like all that spending, and it has nothing to do with free markets and capitalism. I mean, when they rig interest rates and all these things. So, but the Republicans and conservatives don't put up much argument. They just let the far left, and the left, some of these people just want power and control. I think they use the whole issue that they want to help people and help people get along and more equality. I mean, that's just their gimmick to get power.
Would you compare MMT? I don't think it's really anything new. It's new packaging, new marketing. But would you compare it to similar stuff to what John Law did in France?
Well, in many ways, I think that's the case, because you have to deceive the people, and certainly there was a lot of deception then, and that's where the enemies of liberty are very, very good. There is a very strong coalition, and they're in the business of deception, and right now it's rather disgusting. That the major media, everybody talks about that, the minor media too, and even the internet is very much controlled by the establishment. So yes, it's the perception that really counts, and therefore, if the case is that we're better off now than we have been in a long time, and even if it's based on some inflation and spending, conditions are better compared to others. Our problem is that it's at the sacrifice of the wealth of some people, and also at the sacrifice of our liberties. And I think I try to hone in on the whole issue of liberty and personal choices and voluntarism, and that leads to a society that protects property, and then you don't have to find out which group gets what, and if you give one group something, you have to take it from somebody else. It's a real mess. So it's a philosophic struggle. It's an ideological struggle. It's the whole idea of collectivism versus the rights of the individual to live our own individual lives.
And I think there's a lot of people now, a lot of Americans that used to be the middle class, that are just truly desperate financially. They're being ravaged with inflation that's being lied about, currency debasement, and also taxes. And then they blame it on capitalism. They don't blame it at all on the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, these central banks, not just the Federal Reserve, have made the wealth gap worse in the last 10 years. Everything was papered over. Money went into the rich people who were owning stocks, bonds, real estate those things?
No, there's really no challenge whatsoever with liberals or conservatives because they might fight over who's in charge and how to write the checks. But liberal spending and conservative spending, they blend together. Democrats vote for the military spending too, and Republicans vote for welfare spending. But the important thing is if you had more honest government, can you imagine what it'd be like if every American had to pay their share of the expenses every month and write a check? They couldn't do it. This whole thing would be over. But because they have this gimmick going on that they can delay the payment, print up the money, and the people trust what the government's doing. And then when finally somebody has to pay, it's not related to the spending. But I try to tell people that anytime there is spending, it's a tax. Spending equals a tax, and then sometimes it'll raise taxes on your income, but sometimes you just send the bill to the Treasury and they borrow money, and sometimes they send the bonds to the Federal Reserve and they print the money. But it's always a tax on the people, and yet it's hard for people to understand that. And there's no incentive for exposing the Fed unless they think they can get more. If they had control, maybe their guys can get more than the other people. But no, the military-industrial complex and the welfare state would not exist if you had a true monetary system and made people dependent on what they work and earn. But the wealth is not created. They say, well, it does a lot of good. No, the Federal Reserve does not create wealth. It just redistributes wealth, and it undermines wealth. But the productive citizens, the only way you can produce wealth.
And Murray Rothbard said that all government spending should be subtracted from GDP. He thought that government spending was that bad, that it was that bad on the economy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a negative, and instead of saying, well, the government has 40% of the GDP, and that's good. No, 40% of it was taken away from the people to make the decisions. So it's deception, and that's what the people I had to work with. It was always in the business of doing was deceiving. But sometimes it wasn't like they were really bad people. I think they used what they've been taught. I mean, the universities teach deficits. You shouldn't bother. Oh, this gold standard is ridiculous, and so they have the ammunition of the intellectual community defending what's going on. And of course, that's very convenient. Well, it's not me. It's these very smart people who teach us this in the university and Keynesian economics. Deficits don't matter, and look how much we've gotten away with so far. And so it's a little bit more difficult to say that if you continue to do this in next year, you may be very sorry for ever having created this situation.
You and Daniel McAdams and also David Stockman, who's the only confirmed speaker so far for the Ron Paul Institute conference coming up next month in August, are going to be covering these topics about welfare and warfare, military spending, war, and also the Federal Reserve, right?
Right. And Jason, I hope to see you there.
Oh, I already bought my ticket, Dr. Paul, as soon as they went on sale.
Okay. Very good, but very nice to be with you today.
Can you want to give our listeners some clues about who the other speakers are going to be at the conference?
Well, to tell you the truth, Daniel handles that, and we're in the middle of some may have said yes, but maybe not absolute. So they have to tune in to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Okay,
that's a good teaser, but let me just add there for extra marketing that you guys always get a good guest list. Last year was Nassim Taleb you had. The year before was Julian Assange called in via video, and the year before that was Edward Snowden, right? So you always have good guests there.
Yes. We've been pretty fortunate in getting people, but actually, Daniel's very good at this, and this was started when I got out of Congress. And I always think, well, people aren't as interested in foreign policy as they are on domestic policy. But I've been pleasantly surprised. We've had a lot of very intense interest, and the conferences have been very popular.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again for your time, Dr. Paul. My listeners love hearing you come on for interviews, and hopefully I'll be able to interview you again in the near future and ask you about the U.S. versus China trade war because we didn't get to touch on that.
Very good, Jason. Thank you.
Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the Wall Street for Main Street YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Thanks for helping Wall Street for Main Street pass the 20,000 YouTube channel subscriber milestone despite YouTube censorship. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to 30,000 or even 40,000 YouTube channel subscribers quickly if YouTube doesn't shut down this channel. If YouTube does shut down this channel, remember to also sign up for the Wall Street for Main Street email list that's on the wallstreetformainstreet.com website and will tell you where the videos are going to be uploaded instead of YouTube. Also, if you really like the content and you decide that you want to give a one-time donation, you can go to wallstreetformainstreet.com, that's wallstreetformainst.com website, where there's different options for you to do so. Or you can become a Patreon contributor. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to providing my loyal listeners with some of the best information, analysis, and financial education available out there, free or paid, as I work to grow the podcast and also get my educational technology company funded.